As we are residents of Ontario, we want to honor and respect the laws of this province and of course of Canada. So you've already met Firdaus. She's the project manager for this particular program, and she has other team members here as well, Jasmine Ali Ghami and Iman Ahmed Noor, who have been supporting us on all of the logistics and details for this project. And now I think we can move on to the next slide. So why are we doing this? Why are we all here this afternoon? Well, this is no surprise to probably most of you. There is a marked increase in discrimination against people who are Black, Indigenous, and who are different from others in different ways. 20% increase, notably, in recent years. And then another staggering statistic is that there has been a 253% increase in hate crimes against Muslims. This comes from Canada's statistics agency, Statistics Canada, and this figures from 2012, and it's between 2012 and 2015. So just imagine what the increases might be now that we've, had many incidents since of attacks on Muslims and Muslim women and girls in particular. And then there is this other issue, and that is violence against women and girls. So 73% of women are abused online worldwide. That's why it's really important for the girls here today to understand why it's important for you to learn what to do if you experience abuse online, when you're on your social media or even doing your searches for school, why it's important for you to learn how to protect yourselves against abuse and harassment in the online space. Next slide, please. So we have a wonderful website for our digital anti-racism education project. That's the short form is DARE, D-A-R-E. And the website's called daretobeaware.ca. So I would encourage all of you young folks that are here and the parents to go and visit this website. It's full of different stories of women and girls telling their own stories. We have an amazing campaign that we'll tell you about a little bit later. Firdaus just put the link to the website in the chat box. So feel free to visit it at leisure and also provide feedback to us and send us questions if you have any. Thank you. Next slide, please. So a little bit more about our digital anti-racism education project. So this project is DARE 2 because we've done a DARE 1 where we focused on different things. This one here focuses on better understanding how Islamophobia further marginalizes racialized women and girls using an intersectional lens. And by intersectional lens, we mean all the different ways that we are different, that make us a human being, that put us together, all together, but we have so many different aspects to us. We have many different intersectional identities. So the project aims at bringing out stories of marginalization and racism experienced by Black and Indigenous Muslim women and girls, queer Muslim women and girls, French-speaking Muslim women and girls, and Muslim women and girls with diverse abilities. The project is funded by the Department of Canadian Heritage. Next slide, please. Just to briefly share with you what we're going to be learning today. The first part is going to be discussing what is Islamophobia, what does it look like? And then the second part, the second half of it is going to be on countering cyber hate. So what to do when you see online hate, and also what offline hate looks like in Canada. And then you're going to learn about what to do in very practical ways as an individual, as a single person, or maybe collectively as a class or a group, what you can do to counter the hate that we see online. Next slide, please. Just a content warning. Some of what you're going to see and hear might be disturbing to you. And if that's the case, just please feel free to take a break. Just walk away for a few seconds or a minute or two, and then come back to us, because you will need to do that, especially if any of it is making you upset. Okay. We also have, we'll put a link in the website to some resources which will be helpful to you. Okay, next slide, please. So just a few ground rules for this particular workshop. Please know that we will have multiple viewpoints and opinions. Not everyone will share our opinion. So be respectful of that and acknowledge that that will happen. Also, know your own intentions and the impact of what you may say or think or do. Like I said earlier, you may need to step back, just, to breathe and then come back. Also recognize your own privilege. I mean, we're all here, we're able to get together like this, and honor the different experiences that we have brought into this space. So each of you will have had very different experiences, and we need to honor that. And we would like to say that when you do want to challenge something, what you're hearing or seeing, please do that with care and empathy, because we want to be kind to one another. And please put your questions in the chat box as we go along. So feel free to put your comments and questions in the chat. Thank you. Next slide. So now, who's going to be doing this workshop with you for the rest of the time here? So I'd like to now introduce you to Sultan Rana. Sultan has been an educator, so he knows your world very well. He's been educated for 13 years and would be best described as a person who is under construction. So he's still figuring out what he is and who he is, I think. That's what it means. Working for the vast majority of his career in the elementary panel of the York Region District School Board, Sultan has also taught in both secondary classrooms and on university campuses in Malaysia and the United States. He holds an MEd in digital technologies. Sultan worked as a digital literacy consultant for the York Region District School Board for a couple of years, and attempts to be a leader at integrating digital technologies both in his practice as a K-12 educator and in his current position as a seconded instructor at York University's Faculty of Education. Sultan has written resources, conducted workshops, and supported educators, both candidates and seasoned, on topics, this is, I guess, at the post-secondary level, on topics related to modern learning, CRRP, tell us what that is, that would be great, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, and Islamophobia for a number of schools, conferences, symposiums, and organizations, both in person and online for the past decade. So welcome, Sultan, and over to you, and good luck.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you for that very generous introduction. So I'll just start off with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Everything, inshallah, I do well for this presentation. It's by the grace of Allah. And anything that I mess up on, please know I own that. And inshallah, you can forgive me for that. So I really appreciate, thank you so much for the introduction. I appreciate the ground rules too. Definitely want to start off letting everyone know this is a presentation by, with our organization. And I hope by me identifying as a male, as gendered male, I hope we make it very clear that while CCMW by its acronyms is the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, let's be very clear that the struggle for equal rights and liberation and for equity for our sisters in Islam is everyone's role, men and women in Islam. And if one of us aren't liberated, and none of us are. So I hope I thank this organization for inviting me, but I hope I'm also representative of the fact that this is everybody's work. And furthermore, thank you to the ground rules. This is a presentation on Islamophobia and not on Islam. So please, I really, really appreciated those ground rules. Anything that we share here is not It is like, as we all do, we look through the lens as a Muslim, but understand we're talking about Islamophobia and the victims of Islamophobia. And often and sometimes the victims of Islamophobia don't even identify as Muslims. So let's just keep that all in our minds as we think critically and engage in this presentation. All right. So inshallah, everything is copacetic, but know that as Muslims, we always do invite critical thought and conversation. That's a part of our iman. That's a part of what we do in the Ummah. So thank you so much. Let's move on to part one, which is what is Islamophobia? And, we don't want to do this in a way where it's like, I'm reading to you off of a board. Let's just break down really what it is. There are definitions, but let's just kind of go into what it is. So before we do that, let's break down a few micro definitions in it. So this is like a literacy class. Sorry, everybody. This is like that 100-minute period you may have in your class or that course you're taking in high school. But a myth, as you can see there, unfounded or false notion. Okay. And a stereotype is an incorrect assumption based on things like various identities, race, color, ethnic origin, place of origin, etc. Typically involves attributing the same characteristic. So the one thing you think about one person, you ascribe it to the whole group and all members of that group, regardless of their individual differences. And this is often based on misconceptions, incomplete information, and really just people just fearful and scared. So let's go to the next slide, please, because we're going to talk about the stereotypes that Muslims often endure. And sorry, could I just ask a request to everybody? If you're on this right now, just quickly check your Zoom that you're on mute. I don't want to call out anyone named, but please check that you're on mute. I can see one person right now is absolutely not on mute. So please go on mute. And if not, could our host please mute them? Please and thank you. Sorry, with the headphone, you're all up in my head here. So the biggest stereotype that often Muslims get is that the actions of one of us or one who may identify as Muslim, may not be acting like one, but the actions of one are ascribed to all. And, sometimes the very easy one is, oh, I thought all Muslims were brown. I thought all Muslims were Arab. Oh, you're Muslim, but you're Chinese. I don't understand. Like that is a stereotype. So that's a very innocuous one, like one that doesn't really ruin our lives. But then there's the extreme ones, the ones that really talk about who we are and our intentions and our faith. But before we even get to that, let me just be clear. And I don't think this is news to any of you, but if it is, Muslims, we are not a monolith, meaning we are not one kind. We are not one type. Alhamdulillah, we are the second biggest and still the fastest growing faith in all of the world. There are Hispanic, Latina and Latino and Latinx Muslims in South America. We got Muslims in all corners of the world. I wouldn't be surprised if there were Antarctic Muslims. We got brothers and sisters praying and fasting for almost 20 hours a day in Nunavut because the daylight time there. We have the Ummah all across the world, and there are Muslims all around the world. And as you can see on the graph there, the vast majority of them are in Pacific Asia, particularly Indonesia and Malaysia. So there is a rich diversity of Islam. There's a rich diversity of how to understand Islam and how Islam is practiced, still keeping the same sunnah intact, but always with the rich diversity and eclectic mix of our various cultures and other identities we have there. So we aren't one thing. We aren't one thing. Okay, next slide, please. And so let's just break down those, how we are not one thing, a little bit more decisively. So as I was saying, we're not a monolith. We're not one same thing. We're very diverse. A myth that often is ascribed onto us, and let's not pretend who it's ascribed from. It's often just ascribed onto us from the West, from the perspectives of, white, Christian, not even white sometimes, just non-Muslim perspectives that are just put onto us like we're one big clump, we're one big thing. That we like to be separate, like we want separate rules for us, we want everything to be catered to us. No, that's not true. That's not even in our beliefs. We are supposed to abide by the laws of the land. So we want to be integrated, we want to be interdependent, we want to be in the community with other individuals who are either in the faith or not. The myth is that we believe, that or the myth is that we're inferior, like there's something wrong with us, when really we have a long history and legacy of contribution to human civilization and key roles in every sphere of Canadian society. Just because our teachers and our schools don't bring us up in our math classes about how it's the Muslim world that came up with algebra, the Muslim world that came up with the first university, first library, just because our teachers and our education system is not doing right by telling us these things does not mean that we are actually inferior. This is how erasure happens. We've been pushed out of knowing that we are contributing members to humankind. That Islam oppresses women. Okay. The reality is women have their own agency and choice. And that is where Islam became the first equitable religion. Okay. Nobody has the understanding that we know that the first layperson to accept Islam was Hazrat Khadija. Okay. Nobody knows the dynamics between that. And no one understands those things. No one understands in depth the high regard that we have for both genders in Islam, but we have different roles. So, we've just been typecasted, that we're violent. Okay. We don't even need to get into that. Okay. Muslims are actually partners and supporters, and probably the first faith to ever come up with rules of engagement for conflict, which is a human attribute. That we're manipulative and untrustworthy, that there's something, fiendish about us. Islam is seen, and the reality is Islam is a genuine religious faith and practiced sincerely by its adherents. Okay. And the mistakes of some of us, as we are all mistake prone, does not have the right to be ascribed to every single one of us. One Muslim makes a bad decision. Why do we all suffer? But again, we're going to talk about why that happens, because that's very Islamophobic. And that, as Muslims, the myth is we can't be told otherwise. We can't take criticism, and we can't have a thoughtful conversation about Islam in a critical lens. The truth of the matter is that criticism is considered and debated and invited. That's why we have Jummah prayers. That's why we congregate, to constantly have these critical conversations. So there's a lot of myths that are being said about us without us in the conversation. And the reality is quite the opposite of what's being said about us in the media and amongst like-minded people. Next slide, please. And so we just want to also be clear, like, this is, Islamophobia is not a bunch of nasty things said or people mistreating us. There is a link to all these nasty things, all these negative ideas, all these laws that get passed based on false ideas. There is a link to this, to the inevitable harming and violent destruction of either Muslim individuals or full aggression against Muslim societies. And what Sister Iman has presented to you on the screen right here is the pyramid of hate. And it comes from the Anti-Defamation League. And I just want to take a moment here to say that while we subscribe to this model and agree with it, the organization in which it comes from, we do not wholly endorse. So please know that we're focusing on this model and this framework and not on the organization. But as you can see, and I'm not going to read it to you, the pyramid of hate starts low. It starts at bias. It starts at the opinion where it's like, oh, Muslims, they're kind of like, meh. And you, Zayn, thank you for muting. All right. It starts off at bias. It starts off at the lower level things. Then it comes to individual acts of prejudice where, a parent's not so cool with you being friends with a Muslim, or a teacher kind of, rolls their eyes and gets annoyed with the student that asks for accommodations during Ramadan, or asks for accommodations when the school trip has a sleepover event to it. And, there's some Muslim parents who have some questions about it. And it gets to real discrimination where it's you're now excluded. We have people who are in managerial positions who will look at resumes and see a very Muslim sounding name, and before even reading your resume, push it aside. Or a bank teller who sees a loan application, I was like, ooh, and sees a Muslim name and rejects it immediately. So you can see now how everything kind of feeds into each other. It's like a tributary, where one little waterfall feeds into another waterfall, feeds into another waterfall. Then it's not far from these acts of discrimination where we actually get to moments of violence, where these things building up onto each other, and we're surrounded, hateful people are surrounding themselves with other hateful people that say things about Muslims, where eventually the idea comes to their mind where these are bad people who deserve to be hurt. And then you can see from orange to red, we are not far off from the belief, from just even violence to one small group or one individual, the violent belief to saying, you know what? It's not just some of them, it's all of them. So the reason we show this pyramid to you is to show you that everything is interlinked. Nobody is just born ready to be violent. It is a small trickling into bigger, further ideas, and supported by false myths and misconceptions about people. And myths and misconceptions are coming from all different directions, not just one angry uncle that meets up with you every Sunday. It's coming from all different directions. Next slide, please. And, we don't have to spend too much time here, because the moment when we talk about Islamophobia, or the moment when it's comfortable for all people to talk about Islamophobia, is when we see horrendous occurrences of in the pyramid of the orange section of violent acts. That's where everyone's stops and it's like, this can't be us. We're not like this. This is not Canadian. When we see the horrendous massacre that happens in a mustard on a regular Sunday in Quebec in 2017, or we see the entire brutal taking away of the Upsall family in London as we did this past year. That's when we're willing to have the conversation. But then everyone's like, how did this happen? Why us? Why now? Next slide, please. Let's break down why us, why now. The media does a very good job at this. And I'm not just talking about your typical like Fox News and Toronto Sun and all these things that we as Muslims often are like, yeah, those are definitely have issues with Islamophobia in those publications. It's everywhere. It's global news. It's every one of our news agencies. We're not going to take too much time to show you the video right now because of their time. But if you wanted to Google after this presentation, Islamophobia is on the YouTube channel, on their YouTube channel, you'll see a great number of videos that speak about in detail how the media actually covers stories that involve Muslims compared to those who are non-Muslim around violent attacks. So without saying it, we even have the media making us think that the majority of terrorist attacks or violent attacks are done by Muslims. And they're covered far more than those who are non-Muslim, even though in reality, non-Muslim perpetrators of terrorist attacks and attacks that are far more brutal get less attention than those who have culprits or suspects Muslim sounding names. Again, that's for you to engage with on your own. We'll provide you those resources in an email after the presentation. But let's just ask ourselves, why even Muslims? What benefit is it to people to pin Muslims as the perpetrators or as the creepy, suspicious infiltrators? Next slide, please. People make money from this. Anti-Muslim groups received more than $119 million in funding in between 2008 and 2011. And I will put money on it with cool websites like GoFundMe and Kickstarter and all these other ones. With smart marketing and smart wording, other anti-Islamophobic groups who will hide themselves as, not anti-Islamophobic, anti-Islamist groups who will hide themselves as human rights groups or caring concerning parents or mothers or educators. They're also making money. There is a very, very solid income experience with groups that partake in Islamophobic rhetoric, Islamophobic talk, including news agencies. Okay. And as we saw from the horrendous president, Donald Trump, these aggravating individuals get ratings. They get ratings. So if you're talking the language of Islamophobia and it gets you ratings, that gets you money. So this is what makes Islamophobia unique in a lot of cases when it comes to antagonism, because it's a moneymaker to engage in this. Next slide, please. And you know what also perpetuates Islamophobia is that the laws that we have that target Muslims, and they're coded to sound like, oh no, it's for everybody. It's meant to protect Canadian culture against all different forms of really like obvious otherness in Canadian culture. But you know what? When you look at it, when you read the laws and you really do the math, it always is all about targeting Muslims. And let's not be plain or jokey about this, particularly Muslim women. Okay, so we have most recently the law that was passed in Quebec about the the religious garb or religious wear piece that speaks about anyone that has any kind of religious headscarves or clothing that's banned from all public spaces and those who work for government. It's we have quite a few, but you can see the three that are on the screen right now: Bill 21, C-51, and there's no question about it. These laws absolutely target Muslim women. And, as I said, Islamophobia affects others. I do have to put it in there. It affects Jewish brothers and sisters who wear yarmulkes, or Sikh brothers and sisters who carry kirpans or wear turbans. It's affecting everybody. So we're not alone in our attacks. Next slide, please. So I just went on a very long speech about what fuels Islamophobia, but let's just break it down what it really is. And this is the way the Ontario Human Rights Commission describes it. And the great thing about it being described in the Ontario Human Rights Commission, it means that everybody in Ontario has to abide by this. So if anything happens in this definition, it's considered Islamophobic. Okay, so racism, stereotypes, prejudice, or fear or act of hostility directed towards Muslims or followers of Islam in general, or even people suspected of being followers of Islam, because we know there are individuals with Muslim sounding names who may not subscribe to the faith, but they're still victims of it. Next slide, please. So let's take a moment here and talk about gendered Islamophobia. And I just want to position myself very clearly that as a person who identifies as being male, what I share here is not my own first experience. It's understood through research and hearing my sisters talk about their experience. So please, my sisters who are also presenting along, feel free to chime in if I don't do this justice. But gendered Islamophobia consists of the ways the state utilizes gendered forms of violence to oppress, monitor, and punish, maim, and control Muslim bodies. So let's just put it out there, okay? When our sisters, if they so choose to wear hijab, they are walking advertisements that they are Muslim to everybody, okay? And however they want to acknowledge that hijab, be it a wrap that looks that, has an Afrocentric flair to it. They want to wear niqab. They want to wear, a hijab. However way they want to articulate it, they are walking through as advertisements. But on top of that, they aren't just exclusively Muslim. We live in a patriarchal world. What I mean by that is that we live in a world where women are oppressed, where men are assumed to be stronger and better, and women have other more oppressed perspectives had onto them. So you mix in, and that's a general sense. I can speak about that in the sense of all Canadian culture, in the way the dynamics between men and women happen. Okay? And if anyone disagrees with me, then fine. Let's have a conversation about women taking a walk out on the street after the sun sets. If you would argue that seems unsafe, let's ask ourselves why, and that's where we can start the conversation about oppression. But women and gendered Islamophobia is both that patriarchal oppression of women mixed with the hatred and antagonism for Muslims. And when you bring both together, it often results in very, very visceral, horrendous, loud, obtrusive, and violent forms of Islamophobia showing itself. Okay. Often, if it's not verbally attacking, it's violent, very violent, and violent from the ripping and decovering of somebody, which is violent and horrendous enough, to the actual physical harm done by a woman. Done to a woman, and often not done by another woman. It's horrendous. So that's gendered Islamophobia. And let's go to the next slide. But I just want to mention something. Gendered Islamophobia doesn't even get the attention it deserves, because as we will be speaking about later, when somebody reports, if somebody chooses to report that they were attacked in the streets and they were attacked because of the identity they hold, often, because gendered Islamophobia is not recognized by our laws, it will often be just seen as assault. Okay. And because hate crimes, to prove a hate crime is so difficult, it will often not even be associated to the fact that this victim was a woman and identifies as being Muslim. It's just seen as assault. So even when we get news attention on it. We don't even have numbers to support it because the police do not receive it as a gendered form of Islamophobia. They just say it's assault. So we have an issue there. But moving on to impacts of Islamophobia on women. So you can take a moment to read there. I'll read out to anyone who is maybe doing busy things in the background. Reports of online hate speech and extremism have surged in Canada. Women who may face multiple forms of discrimination, racial, cultural discrimination, homophobia, and transphobia are at an increased risk of cyber violence. So we're talking in the online world right now. Women age 18 to 24 are most likely to experience more severe forms of online abuse, including stalking, sexual harassment, and physical threats. And let's be very clear, this is the experience of many individuals who identify as women, just being online. And we're not even talking about Muslims. This is an experience that often, unfortunately, occurs at the hands of predatory males and what they do to women. And Islamophobia is one form of discrimination that contributes to Muslim women's experience of vulnerability in public and online spaces. So again, this is, you cannot separate the oppression and the hostile environment women live in. You cannot separate it from Islamophobia and the hostile environment that is experienced through that. They compound on each other. They don't intermix. They build on each other. It's far more painful and far more insidious, kind of like going in. And this really what we're talking about, these fusing of identities and how the oppression compounds on each other. Next slide, please. Speaks to intersectionality. So let's just break this down for you. And if anyone has any questions, you can type it in the chat. Intersectionality is a lens, so a way of thinking and a way of seeing things through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. It's not simply that there's a race problem here. There's a gender problem and a class or a sexuality problem, an LGBTQ problem. Many times framework erases what happens to people who are subject to all of these things. So this is not a Muslim thing. This is not a women's rights thing. This is not a queer situation. This is not a social economic situation. It's all of them mixed together. And that's also what makes Islamophobia very, very cumbersome, because there's so many other things at play that make the impact of Islamophobia online and in person far more heinous than compared to maybe another Muslim or another person who identifies as being a certain gender and Muslim. Next slide, please. And, let's just be very clear that this is not the oppression Olympics. Some identities experience it far more painfully and in more far-reaching ways than others do. So the first, let's just be very clear. The first Muslims that arrived in North America were Black Muslims. Okay. This, again, may meet with the myth that some of us may have, or myths people have of us. Islamic history has roots in Africa, but due to the lack of focus on these historical facts, Black Muslims feel that their identities continue to be erased due to lack of knowledge and inclusion with conversations surrounding Blackness and Muslimness. Now, let me just be very clear here. This is the doing of both parties and powers outside of the Islamic world and in the Islamic world. We do need to take some responsibility of the erasure we have engaged in erasing the Black greatness from our ummah and from our Islamic thought and jurisprudence. So we just wanted to be very intentional at centering Black and Muslim identities in this conversation, because we're trying to undo the work that was done in the past. Next slide, please. And then just, this is not about being nice. This is not about let's all respect each other. This hurts. This is a mental health issue. This is a health issue. If it's mental health, it's a health issue. So let me just read out the points to you, and then we'll go from there. Islamophobia intersects with other systems of racism, and Black, Indigenous Muslims experience the compounding effects of anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism with Islamophobia. Okay? Don't forget, Canada is the only country in the whole Western Hemisphere that has a bunch of laws specifically for a race of people. It's the Indian Act. We are the only nation in the Western Hemisphere that have that. So we have laws and oppressive, violent laws for a group of people. And on top of that, many of them who identify as being Muslim deal with Islamophobia on top of that. So you could just imagine the suffocation of that. Muslims with disabilities often face the dual challenges of being discriminated against for both Islamophobia and ableism. The combination of those two identities greatly impacts their everyday experiences. Also, given the most Muslims are racialized, there are other identities that exacerbate the experience of Muslims with disabilities. Okay. And I think, yeah, I don't need to talk about that. I think that was well explained. They're more like Muslims with disabilities are more likely to suffer the negative effects of information sharing agreements between police and national security agencies. Sorry, this is not related to Muslim disabilities. Let me read that again. They are more likely to suffer the negative effects of information sharing agreements between police and national security agencies, since Black, Indigenous communities are disproportionately targeted by police information gathering practices like carding. So, you know, while we all complain about our masjids and madrasas being disproportionately surveilled by the police unfairly, truly, if you are Black or Indigenous, you're already being surveilled as a community completely on the grounds of your race. So hold in these, again, as I was saying, intersectionality sometimes is the compounding of various forms of oppression on individuals. So we just definitely needed to make space for that, to make it very clear. Islamophobia is horrendous and it's something that we all need to deal with, but some of us are experiencing it in a far more insidious and life invading way than others are. And it's all up to all of us to eradicate that. Next slide, please. So I want to take a moment here to just pause to see if there's any questions or thoughts before we move on that. This is a point where if you'd like to raise your hand and turn on the mic, we could just chime in real quick. Anything in the chat? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Mohammed. Unmute.
Yeah. Assalamu alaikum.
Welcome, salam.
For the part of the Islamophobia industry, can you elaborate more on like how is it being funded or like who is it funding by, like the industry of the Islamophobia?
Sure, and I can only give a very cursory like overview of this because I'm not a PhD expert on this, but from what I understand, let's go from the macro to the micro. So from the big to the little. So from the big is if you have individuals, you know, I'll just for people's sake, you know, Donald Trump, the things that he says, the way it brings attention, it is a ratings booster for a lot of news agencies. And any news agency that has a lot of ratings then gets money from advertisers. So in a way, it's every time he says something Islamophobic or something wild, and outrageous, and it pertains to Muslims, which happened periodically, that positive reinforcement of like, oh, when he says this and we get a lot of advertisers and money, our revenue goes up. That's one form. So that's the macro. That's like the less direct line between Islamophobia and money. But when we go to the more specific, there are a great number of right-wing groups who have a good funding model. I could go as extreme as the Proud Boys, to other neo-Nazi hate groups that have a real visceral hatred for the existence of Muslims. And a lot of these people are individuals who live dual lives. They live hybrid lives. They live in these hate kind of cells, but then they're also politicians, police officers, lobbyists, and they make sure there is a funding model or a funding line to support these groups. So it's and obviously they're very smart about it. They'll make sure there's no connections back to, you know, offshore accounts or accounts that don't have transit numbers that are related to anybody, PO boxes instead of addresses, everything. There's a very smart maneuvering of how to fund these groups. To be honest with you, a lot of those groups are crowdfunded by concerned citizens that believe in this plight and will kind of just in small $20, $50, $100 increments, you know, one person to another person to another person has a surge of income. So it happens at a very like corporate level, in a non-direct fashion where it's like, the dollars make sense. We're just trying to get ratings. We just want our advertising to be watched by a lot of people. It's there down to the very like micro level where it's like people are like, yes, I believe in this cause. I believe that they're all hateful or violent. I'm going to support this group or these causes. Yeah. Does that, again, it's very cursory. I'm not an expert, but that's as I understood it.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. The book that was listed on, and you'll be getting the slide deck after, the book that was listed on slide 18. For anyone, it's the Islamophobia Industry by Nathan Lean. That would definitely give you a more thorough, fulsome. Anyone else?
Yes, Assalamualaikum, Brother Rana.
Assalamualaikum.
Walaikum assalam rahmatullah. I have a quick question. Like we have students in the class right now from age, from 10, 11 all the way to 2022. So let's say, God forbid, something happens on the street. Someone says anything, someone tries to take the hijab off of any girl, or something happens. So for these young kids, what would you suggest? How to respond to that?
Oh, I'm in the middle. I still sometimes when I see reverent individuals like yourself, my heart says, say uncle. So I was gonna say, you couldn't have done this any better. I think everyone thinks I may have paid you to segue us into the second part of the presentation, because what you just asked is exactly what we're gonna go into in our second presentation. So with that said, you've set us up so well. Can we go into the second part to talk about what are we gonna do
Sure, please go ahead. Yeah, sure.
Mashallah, perfect question. So, where does this happen? This happens in, painfully, it can happen when we're in person. And then often it happens when we're online. So what do we do in the offline and online world when we're dealing with this, particularly in Canada? So as Iman has up on the screen here, police reported hate crimes. So the ones that are reported, I repeat this, the ones that are reported, when people actually follow through, we can see that these hate crimes against Muslims are increasing through the years. We have stats from 2017. Just understand, hate crime stats come out, I believe, every 5 years. So these are from then, and I'm sure we're going to get another bout of it very soon. But let's kind of make sense of what is the situation right now and how can we go about it? Because as we talk about what should you do to retaliate against it, we just want everyone to have an understanding of what is the context right now. Like, why are certain things so difficult for us to prove to everyone that what we're dealing with is specific to the fact that we're Muslims and it's Islamophobic, and even people who are assumed to be Muslim are going through this. Next slide, please. So first and foremost, as I was mentioning earlier, it happens mostly online. Okay. And I'm going to say this again, the percentages are like 17%, 11%. It sounds small, but you're about to see why are they small, because things that often get deemed as a cybercrime against Muslims or hate motivated offenses against Muslims are super hard to prove. And it's because there's something a little bit fishy about our hate crimes. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So I want to read this straight from the notes so I don't mince my words and I don't skip over anything. So this is the Ontario Human Rights Commission definition of hate crimes. Okay, so a hate incident is expressions of bias, prejudice, and bigotry that are carried out by individuals, groups, organizations, and states directed against stigmatized and marginalized groups in communities and intended to affirm and secure existing structures of domination and subordination. So basically what that means is there has to be a powerful person, a person who has identities that make them powerful. So let's just be honest, white, Christian, probably male, probably straight, individual. This is not always, I'm just trying to help everyone understand this, has to do something that oppresses or makes the person deprived or left out of something. It could be something just hateful, or it could be the opportunity of getting a job, or it could be the opportunity of being graded in school properly. Like something has to happen where that powerful person deprives or a group of a person that is of a race or background is already oppressed. Okay. So this applies to Muslims. This does apply to South Asians, Arabs, blacks, black individuals, indigenous people. But that's kind of what a hate incident has to be. A hate crime has to be an incident that are also a criminal offense committed against a person or property and motivated in whole or in part by a bias or prejudice based on real or perceived race, national and ethnic origin, language, color, religion, gender, age, mental or physical disability, sexual orientation, or similar factor. So let's just dissect that a little bit. If somebody, let's just say it is an Asian individual, grabs the hijab of a sister, pulls it off, and is violent with her, and is, just screaming horrible words, all of them ascribe to the fact that they're a woman, all of them swears. And nowhere in there does he say, I hate you because you are a Muslim, or go back to your country, you're a Muslim, I don't want you here. That description I just shared with you there, in a lot of cases, would not be, because there was no mentioning of the sister's identity. There was no mentioning of her perceived religion. There was no mentioning of her race or bias. It was just violence on her. And I purposely used a racialized person to confuse the matter even more, because cops like to mix that up. That right there may very well not be seen as a hate crime. When that sister knows she's a target, whenever she's walking in the streets, and that sister knows that every other female in the area wasn't approached by this male attacker. But again, based on the violent action that happened, you can't prove a hate crime because of this definition. So I'll just finish off the notes here and then we can move on. So if we take that meaning of hatred and look back at Canada's criminal code, which is section 319, what do we get? We can see that incitement of hatred and willful promotion of hatred are criminal offenses. But one of the challenging things about our criminal code works is that it doesn't allow police to lay charges of a hate crime. That's another sticky point. Police can only charge a person with a criminal offense like assault or mischief. Then another section called section 718.8.2 of the criminal code provides judges in a court system with enhanced sentencing powers if the court can determine that a crime was motivated by bias, prejudice, or hate. So a hate crime can't even happen at the epicenter of where it happens. It has to be in the system, decided by a bunch of people who weren't there, maybe and probably by a bunch of people who have no idea what it is to be a Muslim, to be a woman, to be middle class. You have people deciding for you the hate you receive. Mind-boggling. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, there's a hate crimes. My bad. Sorry, I should have been saying keep going. I'm sorry, Iman. So here are some of the points I was talking about. So when we think about hate and hate crimes, it's natural for us to assume that threatening others in a hateful way must be illegal in Canada. We might even reasonably assume that Canada's criminal code defines hatred and clearly lays out how a person can be charged with a hate crime. But here in Canada, it's not as simple. Okay, the criminal code doesn't clearly define hatred. Different levels of government, the media and academia don't use one standard universal definition of hatred. Everyone who makes decisions are describing it differently. The famous freedom of, and then there's always a famous freedom of expression case where it's R versus Keekstra from 1990 is worth studying because from this we learned for our purposes how the Ontario Human Rights Commission came together and how things changed, where it wasn't freedom of speech to say something hateful about somebody. Hate is hate. So we wanted to share that with everyone as our friends who are teenagers. I know we have our brothers and sisters who are 10 and 11 years old, but we do have brothers and sisters who are in high school. Your civics class, your law class, this stuff is really, really interesting to bring up to your teacher and say, can we talk about this? Why are hate crimes so hard to prove? Why is hatred so hard? Why is it being decided by judges and lawyers about hatred when The victim knows. So our friends who are in high school, our friends who are doing grade 5 civics, and you're talking about MPs and MPPs, this is really interesting stuff to bring to your teacher and say, can we talk about this? It's still related to the curriculum. Next slide, please. But let's also talk about where a lot of this happens. Okay. Facebook, Meta, whatever you want to call it. It happens there. And you know what? We're led to believe when this garbage happens to us, when this painful experience happens to us, Facebook and Twitter have our back because it's against their policies. Let's look at their policies for a second. We do not allow hate speech on Facebook because it creates an environment of intimidation and exclusion. And in some cases, many promote real world violence. Yeah, no duh. We define hate speech as a direct attack on people based on what we call protected characteristics like race, ethnicity, national origin, religious affiliation, sexual orientation, caste, sex, gender identity, and serious disease or disability. We also provide some protections for immigration status. Some is the key word there, everybody. We define attack as violent or dehumanizing speech, statements of inferiority, or calls for exclusion and segregation. Okay? Let's be very clear. While racist people are ideologically idiotic, they're also very savvy. They know how to use words. Many of them have taken a law class or two. Many of them are very good at the use of the English language or talking in a language that Facebook inspectors don't understand. It is difficult to prosecute hate speech or expressions of hatred online through the court system, and social media makes it just as difficult. There are many different ways that some people express hatred online. Some use mainstream social media posts, and others use things like Reddit and 4chan. Some use video games to spread hatred, and do it through music or do it through their online telephony when they're on video games, like on 360 and stuff. There's even a genre of music called hate rock. So like there's stuff out there. It sounds ridiculous, but unfortunately, this is not made up. So music streaming sites try to remove this information, but as fast as they try to remove it, it gets popped up just as fast. And internet memes shared on social media platforms like Twitter or through instant messaging apps like WhatsApp are also a common way that these expressions of hatred are spread. And some of these robotics and some of these algorithms can't read the text on these JPEGs or PNGs. So it sticks for a while before they catch it. So just keep, they can talk a big game and they can say, oh, we don't stand for this. But the truth of the matter is that the people know how to bounce around this and dance around it. Next slide, please. I just look at Twitter's same thing. It says you may not promote violence against or directly attack or threaten other people on the basis of race, ethnicity, natural origin, caste, sexual orientation, gender identity, religious affiliation, age, disability, or serious disease. We also do not allow accounts whose primary purpose is to incite harm towards others on the basis of these categories. You know what? President Donald Trump had a Twitter account for 4 solid years. So what does that mean for you, right? So these rules aren't exercised across onto all groups and onto all people equally by any means. So what do you have to do as a concerned citizen to fight back? Okay, and to advocate and to make sure you are protecting the rights not only of yourselves but all oppressed people, be it intersectional with being Muslim or not. Next slide, please. So let's go to how can we counter this? How can we actually work up against this? So first things first, be about it. If you have social media, if you're 13 years old, because I don't know if this is a fun fact for any of you, you can't have a Facebook account, Twitter page, or Instagram account unless you're 13. So with that said, if that's news to you, cool. But if you do have a social media page, be about it. Have, for example, we have CCMW has a hate to healing campaign, poster campaigns. We have JPEGs, we have imagery for you to put on. So go ahead and do that. We also have, next slide, please. And we have just some thoughtful understanding of how do we engage in counter speech from a specialist here Aaron Saltzman. So we'll have the video be shown right now.
I'm Dr. Erin Marie Saltman, and I'm a senior researcher at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue in London. Well, we've come to a period where actually online and offline engagement are definitely linked together, but the way that that looks is obviously very different. So hate speech offline is very distinctive, whereas online hate speech becomes quite a big gray area. It's very hard to define, and also a lot more people can sometimes be incentivized to be more extreme online because they can have anonymous profiles. They feel like they're not having to say something in front of direct people. It feels more protected. So we do see more engagement in extremist rhetoric, sometimes online, that people would not necessarily say offline. Counter speech is a term that's really only come about in the last few years. Just like counter extremism as a sector, this is relatively new, especially for governments, but particularly for civil society. Counter speech can also be called counter narratives or even alternative narratives. Counter speech doesn't necessarily mean that it's negative speech. What it means is any sort of pathway or route or project that is undermining extremist rhetoric. So that could be through a campaign, that could be offline through a protest or an initiative, it could be through a hashtag, and it's different types of ways of engaging and countering extremism online. Counter speech, particularly now, is highly important because we're witnessing that the typical things that would work offline, such as censoring hate speech, editing out individuals, not allowing them to have public platform if they're hate preachers, people tend to find online platforms as a way of continuing this. And actually counter speech is extremely effective when we get alternative voices engaging against extremism online, because the typical measures of trying to censor or filter extremist content simply aren't working. In essence, if you're using censorship, you're attacking a symptom instead of a cause. And also it's ineffective. We see the same video or same comment coming back over and over, and actually just countering that with credible voices, with civil society standing up against it, is much more powerful. So civil society has a crucial part to play in counter-extremism and in counter-speech online because they are the credible voice. A government voice or even the head of a tech sector is not actually what is credible. Peers are credible, former extremists, mothers, religious leaders all have a role to play in a very powerful voice. However, for a civil society individual, it can be quite intimidating to go and try to counter an extremist, which is not what I would ever ask anyone to do unless they really wanted to. I personally would not go on a KKK website and say, stop being racist. Actually, there's a lot of ways to engage in hashtags or be a part of larger movements that are really positive, that actually aren't directly attacking anything, but actually are just providing really positive alternatives that naturally undermine extremism. And everyone has a role to play in that.
Thank you so much. So let's talk about that. And I really agree with I think it's Dr. Saltzman. But she kind of broke down that we're not trying to. It does nothing for anybody to just silence these people and mute them, because they will find multiple ways. It's very, like, we use the word insidious. It's just like, you know, if they can't find one way in, they'll find 10 other ways in. And you're also not trying to change their hearts. Okay. You are not to go at them. They are where they are. And, you know, by the grace of God, they may come around or see the truth in the wrong that they do, but you are just there to create a narrative and you're trying to speak to things that are not being spoken about, and take up as much space as this hateful one. Hopefully so much space it kind of just draws out the hateful speech. So as you can see on the screen there, we have counter speech do's and don'ts, and you did see, I do see it's 3:05. I'll try to wrap up as fast as I can for 3:15. You do see there on the link, there's a link in the chat, and this really speaks to the do's and don'ts. And, you know, let's go to the next slide. There's some very descriptive, easy to read points there about what you should do, how you don't just kind of go blazing in, putting in posts and writing back to every white supremacist group or anti-Islamic group or anti-immigrant group. You got to be thoughtful in what you do, and you have to be say what you mean and mean what you say, and make sure it's thoughtful and make sure it's researched and not emotional and not from a place of defending yourself. We're not here to remind people that Muslims are humans. We are not here to remind people that we deserve respect. That's a given. That's a given. We are not here to remind people that we're Canadians. That's a given. What we're here to do is to change the perspective and change the ideas of what are had about Muslims and what are the responsibilities of Canadians to protect each other and not engage in things to get to such a horrible level as we saw in London and in Quebec. Next slide, please. So please do review some of these do's and don'ts. They're listed in that link that will take you through. And there's some great pointers about staying calm, using humor, using those cool like the agency that you have as a 10-year-old, as a 15-year-old, as an 18-year-old. You don't want old folks like me who are in their 40s trying to make memes for people of your age group to talk about why Islamophobia needs to be eradicated. You know your culture. And by I mean culture, I don't mean the fact that you're Pakistani or Malaysian. I mean, you know your age cohort. You know the culture of what excites you. You know when you're on a video game and you're playing a first-person shooter video game, you know that it's wrong that they're in this video game that you're talking with a whole bunch of people on. You know that it's wrong that the people that are being shot look a lot like you, right? Have those conversations, engage in those conversations with like-minded people and with people from your cohort in a way that people in your cohort would like to talk to. So, sorry, next slide. So these slides that again that are linked give you the very clear and understanding as to how do you engage with this? What should you do and what should you not do? Next slide, please. So if you need a simple kind of 5-step approach, if you need to pass this to your teachers because teachers love to have things packaged in a nice lesson and love to have an actionable. If you are being an ambassador and going to your teacher and say, you know what, we have this, in social studies or in the social justice class in grade 12, we have some great learning. How about you put this into one of our lessons, particularly around Islamophobia or fighting any kind of hate? So we have the 5 Ds. If you are ever a witness to someone being attacked and you know it's on the grounds of their Muslim heritage or assumed Muslim heritage, 5 things you can do. First, D, directly confront, if it's safe for you, directly confront the perpetrator and tell them to stop in a safe direction. If it's a woman being targeted, make sure she knows you're there for her welfare and ask her if she's okay. Offer to be there with her and protect her and walk with her or escort her to somewhere that she'll be safe, and stop the perpetrator from committing any further harm or violence if it's happening. If you feel you can do that. If you cannot, there's another, or in conjunction with directing, distract, interrupt the situation by distracting the perpetrator, get him or her to look away and think about something different. Sometimes just screaming out loud that what you're doing is Islamophobic, what you're doing is racist, you're a racist, you're a hate monger, you're white supremacist, you're whatever, you're sexist. Just screaming that and bringing attention from the onlookers onto the situation and having all eyes on the perpetrator might do that. So distract the person. Delegate. If you see other people around you, you don't want to go about this alone. See people who are walking by, see people who are just watching, being bystanders. Tell them, call 911 right now. Tell them, turn on your cell phone and record this right now. Call them and say, make sure she's okay. Pick up her purse, pick up her items are on the floor. Bring people in. Once you call people in and you made that eye contact, they're what's the word? I forget what the word is, but it's they're now in it with you. Okay. And then if you can't do any of those things, or even if you have to, in addition, delay. If the first 3s are not possible, do whatever it takes to just make sure that you're there for the person and follow up with that person, the victim, after the incident, to make sure that they're okay. Make sure that they have support. Make sure that the incident is recorded by you in some way, shape, or form, which we'll get to in a second, and make sure that person has all the things that they need if they wanted to follow up with calling authorities, pressing charges. But make sure you don't do anything without their consent. Okay, they're the victim. Just be there for them and support them as a assistant in any way, shape, or form they need. But if there's a really, really, really important D, let's go to the next slide. Document, document, document. We are seeing with our own eyes. I heard someone say, someone was asking about about the Black Panther Party, which anyone knows is a Black liberation political movement in the 60s that got shut down unjustly by the American government. And a lot of people are saying, do you see the Black Panther Party coming back? Do you think we should resurge? And the answer was the Black Panther Party, all they wanted was accountability. And our cell phones and the cameras in our cell phones are the new Black Panther Party. Document, document, document. Recording and capturing these moments on video make it undeniable the experience that Muslims are facing and the pain and the anguish we're going through just for the sake of our religious identity or pursuit of religious identity. Document, 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 document the time you're there, the place, who was there, what was the location, all of it. Okay. And if you don't have a cell phone, jot down everything I was saying. Okay. And if you don't have a cell phone, ask somebody on location, grab it. Okay. And, I want to be cognizant of time here. Here, online safety, just please make sure you're safe online. There's so many steps. There's so many things that should be taught to you in school right now about protecting your safety. But just empower yourself and protect yourself. Right here, we have a resource for empowering internet safety guide for women, particularly the actions women could and should take to protect their identity, to make sure they can defend themselves when being attacked online. But digital self-defense for us is needed, and we also need to pay attention to it. Sorry, Aman, I forgot to ask you to move forward. It's needed for us to pay attention to, and a lot of learning that has to happen when we need to understand how much of ourselves is encrypted on the internet. How much are we giving of ourselves onto the internet for the corporations like Meta and Facebook and Twitter to do with it? So know what of your data is being put onto the internet. Know what you can do to withhold data and withhold your personal identity from being used and used in the wrong ways on the internet. Next slide, please. And just know how to control things that are on there. Control exactly who sees what. Don't let potential stalkers know who you are or where you are. Please, everybody, don't put on your status you're going on vacation or where you are at that moment. Block harassers and put creeps on restricted lists. The moment you're bothered by something, just get rid of them. Report imposter accounts and prevent revenge porn, which means not that it's about you. If you see it, do everything it takes to report it. Do everything it takes to protect the identity of victims whom this is happening to. Okay, and I'm gonna end in 30 seconds. All right, so let's go on next. This is kind of like how to keep yourself protected 101. Keep going. We're gonna be sharing the slide deck with everybody at the end here. Keep going, please. And you know what? You got to spot fake news. And if you want to put anything on your social media about fake news, please do so. Next slide, please. Yep, fake news. Again, our poster campaign. And then again, I'll just end off here. If we go to the next slide. Collective counter speech. This is just about like, what do we do as a full collective, as a full ummah to fight against this? Next slide, please. There are numerous campaigns going on. We have campaign planning processes that are occurring through the CCMW and through other organizations as well that allow us to do full campaigns that fight against this. Join, be a volunteer, be a community member, and be a member of your culture, your age group, your cohort, to be a seat at the table, because we don't want one type of anybody running these events. We need a diversity of people, able-bodied, different genders, different sexualities, different socioeconomic classes doing this work. Next slide, please. And these campaigns are happening through CCMW, and we have toolkits if you want to start your own campaign. Next slide, please. And finally, advocate your teachers. Ask your teachers to do this learning in the classrooms. Media Smarts is a great website for teachers to find lessons on that they can bring into the classroom to bring this. It's a part of the curriculum to be savvy on the internet and to be internet safe. And being anti-Islamophobic and having counter speech against hate speech is a part of being internet smart. Next slide, please. And then, we'll just end off with this, with asking you, how are you going to act after this? You've been listening to me tell this speech for almost an hour. what are you going to do now? And that's the call to actions are on the screen there. So Jazakallah khair for listening to me, and let me engage in what I engage in. Some of the examples are personal that I use for myself, but I hope the point was received. So next slide, please. And we do have, just to let you know, and we'll be ending off by saying, where is this funding coming from to do these presentations? A lot of this funding is contingent on the fact that we are actually having an impact, like we actually are changing minds. So we're going to be sending you a link to please do a post-workshop survey to let us know how effective this was, or how is it impacting you to maybe be a change in your community. Thank you, everybody.
MashaAllah, thank you very much, Brother Sultan. Amazing presentation. And before Vice Principal Zilaf will go ahead and address, MashaAllah, what need to be addressed. Sister Soraya, Sister Jaffrey is here. If you want to take mic for a second, for those, so please go ahead.
Okay, just to conclude, thank you very much, Sultan, for a great presentation, engaging us in a lot of food for thought, certainly. And Brother Tahir, thanks for having us. We wanted to tell you that this project is funded by the Government of Canada, by the Department of Canadian Heritage. And without them, we couldn't have done this particular project. So thank you, everyone, for sticking around and listening. And I hope you learned some new things and that you can apply them to your lives in your classrooms. Wonderful to be here, and thanks to the organizers and Soraya and Firdaus and team. And inshallah, we'll see you again, maybe at another workshop. And so please go and visit our website, daretobeaware.ca. It has a lot of resources I mentioned. And check out our social media links or handles. There's a lot of material there as well. Last but not least, on the final slide, we have contact information. You are going to get this slide deck, so you'll be able to see all of the links and all of the information there. Okay, have a great afternoon, and Alhamdulillah, we've ended the session.
Thank you.
Okay,
thank you, Soraya, for connecting us to Brother Tariq. And Brother Tariq, thank you for giving us this opportunity. Sultan, you were great. Thank you so much. And Nuzat as well. Khuda Hafiz. Salams.
Assalamu alaikum.
Sister Soraya, are you there?
Soraya, any final words? I think her granddaughter is not too well, so we'll just leave it at that.
That's
but thank
fine.
you to all for attending
So
the session.
Zilaf is here, Vice Principal. Zilaf Fatma, please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I would just like to conclude on behalf of our staff and students. Thank you, Sister Soraya, for making this important introduction. Thank you, Sister Firdaus, Sister Jaffrey, Brother Sultan Rana, for the wonderful presentation, and to the Canadian Council of Muslim Women who are doing such great work in the community and in the country. We all understand that Islamophobia is a detrimental issue, and we all face it in our daily lives. So we really appreciate you taking the time to come out and educate our students and staff about this issue.